welcome to HipMojo Show 24. I'm your host, Ashkan Karbasrushan. CT Moore, again, is not here, so replacing him is none other than...
Rebecca Brayton from WatchMojo.
So, Rebecca?
Yes.
Busy week as always?
As always.
Running around filming everything under the sun. Okay, before we get on with the show, I'm very curious. You interviewed a lot of people. What's your favorite all-time interview you've done at WatchMojo?
Well, we did, I encounter a lot of different types of people. I'm always surprised at,
Just at the office alone?
Well,
sure.
yeah, that's for sure. I'm always surprised at how kind of just genuine and nice some of the music acts that we interview are. But one of the nicest people I've ever interviewed is actually a sports anchor on TSN. Is it TSN?
Yes, it is.
Yes,
TSN.
it is.
Yes.
James Duthie. He wrote a book called The Day I Almost Killed Two Gretzkys, I believe it was called. And he was just a really genuine guy, really nice guy, and it was a great interview.
Did he also try to pick you up like everyone else that you interviewed?
No.
No, okay, good. Maybe that's why you...
He's married with kids, so.
All right, sorry about that, James. Okay, so it's funny. When I was at my old life at Ask Man, I did a lot of interviews. Now, I think your interviews are more glamorous because they're live and in person. That's very different, and they're recorded. I used to do most of my interviews over the phone. One time I remember interviewing Carl Cox, the DJ, in his hotel room, which was rather eerie.
Sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. My favorite interview, I interviewed Gene Simmons of KISS twice. The first time was in 2003, right as Iraq had started, but it was already going pretty bad, and I just asked him naively, most rock stars were anti-war, so at the end of a 30-minute interview, I was like, so what do you think of the Iraq war? And he's like, it's amazing, I love it. I was like, what? I'm like, what about the carnage and destruction? And so after the 30-minute interview, we went on for another 30 minutes, and I was actually recording that over the phone, but in a radio station where I was also, anyway, so it was interesting. And then what's funny is when I re-interviewed Gene Simmons in 2005, and by now Iraq was a disaster, I was like, you do recall we've spoken before? He's like, yes. I was like, so what do you think of Iraq now? And he didn't answer. He just went straight to, so the new album is so-and-so. Anyway, but I knew it was time for me to leave the interviewing game when I interviewed Ja Rule a third time. That's when I was like, enough's enough. I've done this. Okay, so let's get to the show.
Okay, so you wrote a follow-up article on entrepreneurship and fundraising called Things Entrepreneurs Should Avoid When Fundraising. Would you mind explaining that one?
Yes. I mean, when I started the whole TechCrunch series, I was mainly writing about the video industry. And I remember telling Eric Schoenfeld, the great editor-in-chief at TechCrunch, that, I used to write these young pro articles. I'd like to do this kind of stuff. And he was like, no, let's do the video stuff. You have all these stats. They do well. But now, because I've covered every nook and cranny of online video, lo and behold, the articles are evolving into that young pro advice. So what are the main things? I think, most of the mistakes that entrepreneurs make, I think, boil down to not so much VCs being these vultures. I think a lot of it is actually inexperience and basically thinking that so long as I maximize the valuation that these investors put on my company, then it's smooth sailing. And I actually think that's the mistake. I think a lot of the things that are obvious, like investors like preferred shares versus common shares, which is basically just they get their money before you do, or the fact that VCs like to get their legal fees reimbursed with the money you raise, which is a bit odd. You're like, wait a second, this is money I'm raising to grow my company. Why are you taking your legal fees from the? And these are things that entrepreneurs just have to accept. As I say it, it's part of the system. And lastly, it's just a reality. You have one baby, your company. A VC has like 20 companies he's invested in. He just won't care so much. So that's like the main thing involving the system. Things that I think as an entrepreneur you shouldn't try to fight. It's not worth it.
Right. So bullet point number 2, it's them.
Yeah, okay, so then there's these other things where I do think that you as the entrepreneur should maybe fight, and they're very subtle points. For example, the board. I personally have maybe 10 to 20 great advisors. My board is pretty light, to put it mildly. That's fine. I do look forward to building a board one day, but you have to be careful. You can't invite every person in the world to sit on your board because ultimately the board decides who the CEO is, and the board decides if they approve a budget or not. So for example, like if I were to construct a board and I bring on an investor, okay, let's say they get 20% of the company, well, they should have 1 board seat out of 5, for example. And mainly, you should make sure that there's a couple guys that you trust who may push you. You don't want lackeys. This isn't like Rupert Murdoch, but you don't want them to then turn around and screw you just because it's convenient for them. And so basically, when an investor comes on, you basically each appoint your guys, and then there's independent guys, but you should always make sure that you protect yourself because it's called boardroom shenanigans for a reason. So that's one of them. The other one is the chairmanship. I mean, for example, like I'm a business person, so I may want to be chairman because I think I know what to do and how to steer the ship. But I don't have really the experience to be chairman, and I recognize that. I think if you're a technical founder, you probably don't have the interest or the experience. And even like a business person, at some point, you're big enough that you might want to bring on an industry heavyweight. Like we're a media company. If we could land like a great media, executive who's built 5 companies and sold them, obviously then it makes sense to give up. And then the last 2 things in terms of like the things you should try to fight to get fair, don't be unreasonable. One is liquidation preference. What is a liquidation preference? It just means how the pie is split up. You want to make sure that, yes, investors get their money out before the common shareholders get their money out. But if investors get like a 3x or 2x or 5x, and these are things that I explain a bit more in the article, I think you're going to be screwed. And then lastly, there's this concept of vesting. Vesting is the notion basically that, if I have an idea on a piece of paper and I raise money for it, the VCs are going to say, well, you got to stick around for 3-4 years before you earn all of these shares. That's fine. But like, let's say if I compare that to WatchMojo, which I've been running for 6 years, if investors come and say, well, you're going to have to basically wait another 3 years before you vest, I'd be like, hold on, maybe a year, I'd consider 2 if it made sense, but why would I wait 3-4 years? I've already put in 6 years. So these are the things that a lot of entrepreneurs don't realize. They just say, oh my God, this VC gave me a term sheet, we're worth, we're rich, bitch, we're rich, bitch. You're not, and you're going to be poor, and you're going to be out of a job. So that's the second one where I think it's things that the VCs do try to push for, and you have to be careful.
Right. So it's not them, it's you.
Yeah, and then there's where I think the reason why the article did very well is because I was very candid to say, entrepreneurs, we make 1,000 mistakes. Like, how much time do you have? I could tell you 100 mistakes I've done today, so to speak. I think the areas where entrepreneurs do mess up is sometimes when you do get interest, you go and you raise way too much money. So if you raise too much money, the expectations are too high. You think you're king of the mountain, but you really have unreasonable expectations to overcome. 2, you have to raise money when you can, not when you want to. So I don't think you should wait till you're drowning in costs and a short runway before you go out there and try to raise money. And then the last 2 things are basically fear and greed. I think, like personally, I'm always, and this is why I don't want to be a hypocrite when I tell entrepreneurs this, but I think we always fear about the vulture capital, the guy who's going to come and screw you out of your business. At the end of the day, all partnerships can go sour. I had a great partnership with my old partners, but they sued me in the end, and I won. But I'm just saying, like, that goes sour. Your marriages can end up in divorce. So you do have to go in somewhat with positive, positive thoughts, because sure, things can go off the rails, but that's not the way you should start your relationship. And then the last one, I think, is you can't be greedy either. I think you have to make sure that investors get a chance to get a positive return on their investment. And if ultimately they have all this money, it's like they have the ball. They can choose where they're going to go and play. So they have all this money. If you want them to come and back you, you do have to give them both the roadmap to how they're going to make a lot of money, but also mathematically, if I'm coming in at this level and I want to make sure I get a 5x or 10x return, if you can't convince yourself that your company is going to do that, why would they buy into that? So that was the article. I'm going to, this trend is doing well, so we're going to shift gears and probably do a follow-up this upcoming week again to continue the series on TechCrunch.
All right. Well, let's shift gears now to talk about major companies. One in particular is Hulu pivoting.
Yes, I mean, we've heard this term pivot, which is companies changing models. The most well-known one is Groupon, which went from like a let's get together and raise money for a charity to, oh my God, we're giving away lobsters for 50% off, and if we're 500 people that want to eat lobsters, then giddy up. So, I mean, it's like a successful pivot. I actually think that Hulu, seeing what's happening with Netflix, as well as Google funding all this content and getting in the content business, what you are seeing is Hulu, which is an aggregator, a distributor, starting to basically get into content. So they're going to start doing their own productions. It's ironic because I mean, I'm a content guy, but I'd be living in denial in Africa, basically, if I thought that content had beaten distribution. Content, it might be battered, bruised, kicked on, spat on, mocked, ridiculed, but content is still king. But distribution won the dynamic. The number one distribution company is worth a lot more than the top 10 content companies. But what this shows is that it's a very lack of defensive space to be in. So with Netflix getting hammered this year, and realizing that the cost of licensing content goes up, and with Google, YouTube funding $100 to $250 million of original content, Hulu has no choice but to get in the content business, and they're going to spend $500 million to pay out to content partners like WatchMojo, but they're going to get in the content business. So I think you are seeing a pivot where basically every distribution company is going to get into content one way or another. People thought Google would never become one. They are now. They bought Zagat as well. And I think even Facebook, Facebook and all these other companies, and Twitter too. Twitter is now putting on live shows. Tiesto was putting on a live show at CES. We know a few friends who work there. You're going to see more and more original content. So, for 6 years, some of us have been saying content is king. It is. I think you still want to own the throne or the castle, which outlasts any one king. But it is interesting to see these companies pivot.
Very cool.
That was show 24. We promise you, CT may be back next week, and we'll catch you same time, same place.